Number one thing I hate the most in the Marine Corps.
What are some of the roadblocks that you're seeing, or why are Marines getting out?
Well, guys, there you go. I gave you the reasons of why I'm now out of the Marine Corps, and let me tell you, one of the best decisions I've ever made.
So if you haven't noticed, the military is running into a slight recruiting problem. Sergeant Major of the Marine Corps comes out and says, we got to retain better, invest better in troops. And I wanted to present to you a staff sergeant still in, a lance corporal who's a year out, and the sergeant major. Let's see if we can figure out how we can retain more and get people more fired up in the Marine Corps. Let's go.
So the Marine Corps is looking to retain and mature its force. Why and how do you plan to do that?
Retaining and maturing the force, not a new concept, quite frankly.
So the Marine Corps historically has been pretty good about getting people to sign up. Not as many challenges as, say, the Army, but make sure to take a look in the description for the Two Gentlemen's channel. And we got the Sergeant Major here. Let's figure out what the problem is. How do we retain more people?
I think what I would offer as an explanation of why it's a big deal now is, number one, as we see the Commandant, and this isn't new to this Commandant, we've always invested a great deal in how we train and educate Marines.
You know, funding. Oh my gosh, funding is terrible in the Marine Corps Plus. Obviously, you know, for funding, we get the least out of every other branch, so we get the least amount of money to work with.
All right, you heard what the Sergeant Major of the Marine Corps said, this fine young staff sergeant. So funding, that's been a thing since I joined the Marine Corps. We're talking 30 years ago, right? That funding sucked, and we still hear funding. We might as well take funding off the table because we ain't getting it. I mean, you remember the old mop gear, any of you jarheads that spent time at, say, an Air Force base. You go to that dining hall, and you go to the dorm, and you go back to your barracks as a young lance corporal, and you realize it's a little bit different a deal. So the funding ain't going to happen.
We have not had a necessity to do or a calling to do is retain more of that investment.
You have.
I was tired of being treated like a child.
What we're really talking about is that first term Marine, at the end of the first contract. You know, our current model lets go intentionally of about 75% of who we recruited just 4 years ago.
Now, why do you think it is that 75% of the guys you trained for maybe a year-ish, you're let go? Do you think they just lose interest in the oorah devil dog stuff? They get the old eat the apple core, if you heard that one before. Do you think it's the letdown? Or just people do their one hitch? We're going to get the other devil dog who got out as Lance Corporal's opinion on it. And some of this is just people grow out of it. They grow up. They don't decide it's not for them.
5% of who we recruited just 4 years ago.
I wanted to be my own boss. I wanted to tell myself when I wake up.
Right.
I want to tell myself when I go to work. I want to tell myself, you know, when I'm off. And I was tired. I was tired of not being able to go home. I was tired of having to ask another grown man, can I go home and see my family?
What we want to do is we want to make sure that we give Marines opportunity who want, number one, to stay in the Marine Corps. Number two, who have the talent and the skills to succeed, continue to succeed in the Marine Corps.
Let's talk about what the young devil dog who just got out, he said he wanted to do his own thing, right? Get up when you want, grow your hair how you want. I heard a lot of guys say that, right? But the reality is when you get out, you're still beholden to somebody, unless you're self-employed. Most people aren't. They're working somewhere. And that young jarhead was in the infantry. So you don't have any skills that transfer. So guess what? You're doing probably a shitty job unless you go to college. I get it. But you're always going to be beholden to somebody. But I did hear that sentiment a lot, even 30 years ago. Let's keep moving.
You know, and they tried. People tried to get me to stay in. They were like, you know what, Cantrell, we'll let you be a recruiter. You can go recruit out of whatever city, whatever town. They even said I can go down to the Pacific recruiting station. That's how bad they wanted me to stay in. And that was after everything had happened to me, after I had been shitted on for having a YouTube channel and trying to bring in people and all this stuff, and now you want me to work for you.
All right, so his story is a common theme. He was a corporal, got busted to Lance Corporal. Take a look at his channel for those details. But you get a lot of guys that feel like the Corps is screwing them over, and they get jaded. That's a common theme, and it's a leadership issue. You know, leadership can say, hey, young devil dog, you screwed up, but we love you. And a lot of times that don't happen.
And then develop a more mature force. What does that mean? Rather than retrain a whole group of new Marines, you keep more of the ones you've trained.
Do not take it the wrong way. I do not hate the Marine Corps. Marine Corps, great gig. I wish I didn't have the experience I did.
So here you go. He's talking about retaining Marines you've trained, right? So this guy had NJP, gets busted, but he sounds like, if you listen to his other videos, he really liked it. He got jaded after getting burned over something that he thought was stupid, and maybe it's just a life lesson. But you got to retain these guys. I had a guy track me down I knew after 30 years in the Marine Corps. I knew at the time I met him as young corporals, he was going to be a lifer. That was going to be his thing. And some people love it, but you got to encourage this a little bit because they're looking outside and going, it may be better if I get out of the Corps. And they realize it's kind of the same shit, just wrapped differently.
Was still in the Marine Corps.
You start to retrain re-educate, advance those skills, get more and more to the perfection of it is in the art of war. What's the advantage? The advantage is that you have a group of Marines now that have got the reps and sets, who are now capable of taking on the responsibilities the Commandant talked about in his planning guidance of, pushing those authorities down to the lowest level possible.
Hurry up and wait. It's up there, and the top things I hate about the Marine Corps is because it's one of those things that wastes so many people's time, and it just shows how unorganized units can be whenever hurry up and waits.
Well, here's the thing. Toxic leadership, you hear that all the time. But shitty leadership can get guys that are going to be lifers when you met them to get out of the Marine Corps after one hit. They're going to go, this sucks. I don't want to do it. What happens a lot of times is you get some gunnery sergeants trying to prove a point. Maybe he's a shitty leader. Or even worse, you get a young officer, right, that wants to prove the point. PT's at 0500. You need to show up at 0400. And eventually you go, okay, I know when to show up. I don't need you to babysit me.
That can only be done through experience. And experience is a time factor. It's an individual, are you capable factor, but really in terms of maturing the force, it's about retaining our Marines.
Yeah, that would be.
How do you go about doing that? And there's
God bless his soul, but Sergeant Major Black here, the talking points. If you want to retain guys, right, you talk to people like these two fellas on YouTube, the one guy who's still in, the guy who got out. You talk to veterans sub 5 years out and you say, what could we have done to keep you in? Is there anything? You don't just sit there in some bubble talking to other O's and realize, oh, this is what we need to do. Here's what the marketing data tells us. Now, he may have done that. Don't get me wrong. But you got a pool of people who can give you advice. And some of the same complaints I hear in this video from guys that were fresh out or still in are the same shit I heard when I was in. So it's not getting better.
Follow-on question, right? How do you go about that? Number one, in order to stay in the Marine Corps, you got first want to be a Marine. The number one incentive for recruiters to have someone join the Marine Corps is, do you want to be a Marine? The number one incentive to stay in the Marine Corps is, do you want to be a Marine? That's number one.
And I almost got to the point where I hated putting on the uniform. I hated the fact that people knew I was a Marine once I went out in town.
I left this clip in because I remember at Camp Pendleton, we did everything we could and we went out in town to not look like jarheads because there was a stereotype. Certain ladies didn't want to mess with jarheads, military area. I'm not sure we hated it for the same reasons as him. But my situation was different. I didn't get, the NJP. I could see how that could make you jaded, especially if you're, say, at a Camp Lejeune in a town where it's just the Marine Corps base. There's not a whole lot going on. You want to just slide out off work and just be a normal human, not be classified as the jarhead, the troublemaker, the bar fight guy.
Secondly, it's a whole list of other things, and we can talk about them in a subsequent question, but the onus on retaining the force and why and what's the incentive to do so is to stay a United States Marine.
So what are some of the roadblocks that you're seeing, or why are Marines getting out?
All right, so I want you guys to put in the comments what you think the reasons people are getting out of the military in general. The Marine Corps is fine. I want to see if they line up with what the Sergeant Major's telling us. Is he reading off a script? Has he done his homework? I want to believe he has.
Number one on the list is probably quality of life. What does that mean? Quality of life means exactly what it is. The majority of the force is single. The majority of the force live in the barracks. And if the quality of our living conditions isn't where the Marines want it to be, arguably where I think it should be, then what's the option? Let me live off the installation.
I heard that statement. I harkened back to the first time I went to March Air Force Base. I went up there, met some people at the E-Club. They said, do you want to go back to our dorm? Next morning was the dining hall. And I realized, wow, I think it's a little different in the Air Force. And so there is a big difference in accommodations, we'll call it, across the services, and the Marine Corps has always had pretty shitty ones.
If we can't do that, we got to make a choice.
As far as infrastructure, we're starting to get better. We're starting to catch up to the other branches in terms of buildings and barracks and everything of those of that nature. The gear that we have, some of the gear that we have is very old, outdated, obsolete. We need to get rid of it.
Let's talk about gear for a second. We had Alice packs, and I remember getting them from Supply. And these things were Vietnam era web gear, Alice packs, the canteens, the whole thing. I'm in boot camp. I'm at the rifle range. I'm trying to hit the target. Can't do it. Instructor comes over and goes, go get another rifle. So yeah, the stuff you get, the equipment is always the shit. And you really find out it's crappy when you get on other services and you go, wow, we got really the garbage. We got the lowest level, the redhead stepchild shit of the military.
The better question is, well, how come we're not pushing that a little harder as far as how we can, maybe work on that? Everything is driven by resources. Everything is driven by resources. I think what you've seen in the Commandant's planning here the last couple of years, and
When you hear everything's driven by resources, like no shit, Sherlock. But if you're having to recycle guys every hitch, so every 4 years, you got to get a new guy to fill that squad leader role or fire team leader. You think you go, well, maybe it's better for us financially to retain guys than it is to lose guys. That would be common sense in most businesses. Somehow the military, in particular the Marine Corps, doesn't get it because I guess they were churning and burning. Now you got to teach these guys complicated communication systems. Depending on the MOS, could be long schooling. But you know, this is common sense for any other business in the world.
as we go into the future with how we request our resources, there's a heavy emphasis on that quality of life. I'm speaking about barracks in particular, but it's any number of things I can bring up in follow-on questions. But I'd start there. Quality of food in our chow halls, dining facilities. It's a whole different list of questions. Command climate comes up a lot, but what does command climate mean? Command climate does not mean the commander and the senior,
Command climate is the War College word for leadership. How is the leadership? Is it consistent across units? Are we having young lieutenants that are morons coming in? Are we having platoon sergeants that are morons? Are they understanding that we want to retain these guys? Let's not shit on them all the time. This ain't boot camp.
leaders of the organization. Usually it's, if you're a corporal, it's the sergeant. It's the lieutenant. Not that they're poor quality, but young people leading young people, you asked about maturing the force, you get a dynamic there. Maturing the leadership.
Accountability is very huge in the Marine Corps, but if it takes you 4 hours to get accountability, that just tells you right there that your unit's probably not that good at getting accountability. You know what I'm saying?
So you're going to hear a lot of guys get out because they go leadership, toxic leadership, something of that sort. You know, I had this bright idea a long time ago. How about we make the leaders, the company commanders, the best leaders in a bunch of people? So we just don't take somebody who's got 4 years in the military, OCS, college degree, and now they're the company commander. When you got a gunnery sergeant who may be locked on, great leadership, can read people, understands when to push hard and pull back. We don't do that. That's probably one of the few businesses that you don't move up in management based on merit. If you're enlisted, you stay there. You could be smart and a dumbass general, but you're going to stay as the senior enlisted guy. Why do we do that? It don't make any sense today.
Leadership only care about the power of being, in that leadership role. Some of them are so power hungry that they think that even outside the Marine Corps, they have the same power. And it's just funny because it's like, man, if we were just regular people, you would be nothing. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, you would have no power over me.
The number one thing I hate the most in the Marine Corps is mass punishment.
So mass punishment, you get it, happens in boot camp. You're a squad leader. Your squad messes up, you pay. But as you move on, you get outside of training. The mass punishment doesn't make any sense because after a while, you're like, I'm not the up here. That guy's the address him. But let's say a room's dirty at the barracks. All of a sudden, the whole weekend secured. You're cleaning barracks rooms. You're having inspections. That kind of shit gets old. You don't feel like an adult. You're like, I didn't do this. It's not my problem. This guy's an F-up. But they gear a lot of things towards the lowest level moron, and then everybody pays. Stand by.
Mass punishment is one of those things I will never understand. However, there is a place for mass punishment. All right, there's a place for those who be like, well, mass punishment is one team, one fight. No, bullshit. There's not no one team, one fight whenever it comes to certain shit that Marines are getting punished for.
Let me give you a couple examples. Guys in Pendleton go down Tijuana, get in trouble. Then all of a sudden, Liberty's cured for that unit because a couple morons didn't know how to manage their own shit. That's what he's talking about here. A couple guys go out in town, get DUIs. All of a sudden, there's drinking restrictions at the barracks. We don't need to coddle everybody. I get it to a point because you got a bunch of young guys, testosterone-driven. But it's not good for retention long term.
That gets after that command climate thing. And lastly, I got to be honest with you, there's always families involved. There's a kind of a saying, you recruit a Marine, you retain a family.
And what the Sergeant Major said there's a maybe. You're talking guys from 0 to 4 years getting out after one hitch. Most of them, if they have a family, it's a small family, 1 or 2 kids, are already divorced. You know how this goes. But it's not the people who've got the families and have got a couple kids in different schools. But the Marine Corps is terrible at this, say, compared to the Air Force. A guy could be at a duty station for 10 years at the Air Force. Meanwhile, in the Marine Corps, every 3 or 4 years, you got to move around to move up the ladder, the food chain. What would your recommendations be for the Sergeant Major? Seems like his heart's in the right place, has some good talking points. But some of the complaints from these young devil dogs, the same things I heard when I was in. We're talking 30 plus years ago, I heard these things. And we're hearing it today. So what's the answer? What's the fix? Thanks for watching.